Welcome on into the Third Down Analysis Podcast. I'm your host, Danny Jackson, and today we're going to talk about Baylor. I'm going to continue my BYU Opponent deep dive previews, and then I'm going to talk about the BYU receiver position. So let's get this going. Thank you for joining today, wherever you're joining from. So I'm going to continue my BYU Opponent deep dives. I've started with Kansas State. You can catch that in episode 14. I'm going to work through the BYU Big 12 opponents. Leading up to the season, I'm going to do a preview based off of where they were last year and some of the off-season activity. And then during the regular season, I'm gonna do the best I can with my time. This is a hobby as opposed to a full-time job. I'm gonna do the best that I can to give in-season preview of the upcoming opponents. So with Baylor, what I'm gonna do is give you a 30,000-foot view, preview of the offense, preview of the defense, and I'm gonna dive into some data, share my screen as I do this. If you listen to Kansas State, this will follow the same. Format for you. And if you didn't, then you can go back and catch that Kansas State one because it's I think it gave some really good information there. So, and wherever you are, love to hear any feedback. You drop a comment in the YouTube. If you're on audio, you can find me at DJ Danny Jackson on X, Twitter, and love to hear some feedback and go ahead and share it with those of your friends. And one of my goals here with Third Down Analysis, the 3D8 podcast, is to give you insights and data. I'll do a lot of the heavy lifting and tell you some of the stories that I see from the data, and then let you give you some stats, give you some things that you can share with friends, family, coworkers, etc. that make you sound a little bit smarter, honestly. And that help you enjoy the game a little bit more on Saturday. So with Baylor here, what we've got going is their historical record. I wanted to touch on this here for a minute. So you can see that they were pretty good. They were actually really good from the mid 2010s, whatever we call those. I can't remember if they're the aughts or not, but 2011 through 15, they win double-digit games 4 out of those 5 years, and then they hit rock bottom. There was some scandal there with Art Briles. They bring in Jim Grobe. He's there for a year, and then they bring in Matt Rule, and Matt Rule actually gets them into the Sugar Bowl in 2019, where they go 11-3, and then he leaves to the NFL. Dave Aranda comes in, and not great during the COVID year, 2-7. But then the next year, as we all know, 2021, Baylor wins the Big 12. They go 12-2, and then they hit a bit of a rough patch because in 2022, they start out, it was something like 3-3, and then they end up getting to 6-3, but they finished 6-7. So they started off 2022 looking okay. I think at one point they were 3-1, and then from that point, they from about quarter of the way through 2022 until now, they've essentially gone 6-15. So not that great. They've really hit this. They've really been struggling since then, and so there's quite a bit of pressure now on Dave Aranda, which brings me to the 3 key stories that I see here with Baylor. So first is they've got a desperate need to win. Dave Aranda himself has a desperate need to win. You'll see here in a few slides that the coaching changes that they've made are all over the board, and it's a sign that he's got to get things right, which I think is going to create a challenge in and of itself, because in a year where they have to win, every team always has to win. I mean, that's a given in college football, but in a year where they have to win, they're also trying to incorporate a ton of coaches, new systems, get things back to really the 2021 version, which is the second story, is how do they get back to that 2021 version of Baylor? Now, I was at that game in Waco in 21, and the thing that stood out to me about that game that I think most BYU fans saw if you watched the game was the physicality of Baylor. They really manhandled BYU, and that was how I would define the 21 team Baylor. is that they were tough in the line of scrimmage. And when you look, I went back and watched a lot of the film from 23, and I'll show in some of the data that that's where they struggled mightily, was at the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball. And they didn't have that grit and tenacity. It's hard to, some of that stuff shows up in the box score, like how good are you at stopping the run, for instance. And then some of it you can see on screen. And I don't want to speak negatively of their players, because I think any guy who puts on those helmets and pads is tough. But relative to other teams, you could see that they were lacking quite a bit of toughness and grit last year. And so that's going to be one of the questions is, can they get their toughness back? Because you'll see here in a few slides as well that they have a high quality talent. They have a lot of good talent relative to the Big 12. So it's a matter of putting those guys in the right place and getting those guys to get the most out of their talent. And then the third key story here against BYU is the timing and the location of the game. I think it's favorable for Baylor. Now, the timing is earlier in the season, and so the reason why that's favorable for Baylor here is that BYU is going to have 3 out of 4 games is going to be on the road up at that point. So they'll have played, they'll have gone to Texas twice in that month. So they'll go first week of September, they'll go to SMU, and then they've got Wyoming road trip the next week. And then they've got the home game against Kansas State, and then they've got the road trip against Baylor at the end of September. So I know that travel in football is not as big of a factor as it is in basketball, but that is something to note, that 3 out of 4 games, and that's at the tail end, will be on the road for BYU. So, and that's going to be a hard way for BYU to start off this schedule. Instead of getting a lot of patty cakes, they've got SMU and Wyoming, as we well know, and then they've got Kansas State right before that. So BYU is going to come in a bit bruised, and then the location, being in Waco, it's hard to understate the importance of home field advantage in college football. If this game were in Provo, I would have actually picked BYU to win this game, but because it's in Waco right now, I think Baylor's the favorite in my eyes. Now that brings me to the 2024 predictions. So I see Baylor going 6-6 this year. I've got them 2-1 in non-con and 4-5 in their conference games. So I think they'll finish 9th in the Big 12. I've got them losing at Utah, which does not actually count as a conference game because it was scheduled prior to Utah's entrance into the Big 12. I've got them losing at Colorado, at Iowa State, at Texas Tech, home against Oklahoma State, and at West Virginia. So here's where it would have been a little more favorable for BYU perhaps to play Baylor is later in the schedule, because what you're seeing on screen here and what I just described for you on podcast is that Baylor has a difficult schedule, and if they get into a dumpster fire scenario midway through the season where this ship has spun out of control to the point where Aranda and his staff can't stop it anymore from burning and going down, then I think that would have been favorable for BYU at that point to play. But early in the season, Baylor still has a lot to play for. So, but if BYU wants to get a bowl game, this is a game against Baylor where this is one of those games where you have to figure out a way to win the game. So I mentioned some key coaching changes. There's a lot on screen here. So the story here is that Baylor changed a ton in their coaching staff. So they brought in a new associate head coach and coach of the running backs, Keenan Hall. I think that was AJ Stewart was previously in that position, because as we know, Jeff Grimes was the OC, and he's not there anymore. He went over to Kansas. So they bring in Keenan Hall. He's noted as one of the best recruiters in Texas. They bring in Jake Spavital from Cal as the offensive coordinator, and he had previous stops at. He was also a head coach at Texas State, but he had quite a few previous stops. He was at Oklahoma, at West Virginia, at Texas A&M, at Houston. He worked. You can see. He worked with Kyler Murray, with Johnny Manziel, with Geno Smith, with Case Keenum, quite a few other quarterbacks that he worked with. So They bring in a quarterback, Daquan Finn from Toledo, and we'll hit that in a few moments on the offense. But the QB's position is going to be a position of importance for Baylor because they've been struggling there, honestly, the last few years. They bring in a new offensive line coach, Mason Miller. He worked with Mike Leach with some air raid concepts, so it'll be interesting to see if the Baylor offense was a bit conservative in the past. And as you all know, Jeff Grimes, we understand that offense because that's a little bit what BYU is running right now. But they may have a different look. And then on the defensive side, they don't have a defensive coordinator change, but Dave Aranda there's been reports that he's going to start calling the plays. And he was a DC. He was defensive coordinator at several places. He was defensive coordinator, and we'll hit on this in a little bit, but it's some pretty big places. That's a good sign and a bad sign. The defense may improve, but it's not a good sign because that means that, like I said, Aranda's he's trying to save his job, and for his sake, I hope he does. Defensive line. This is impactful. They bring in Inoke Brechterfield, who was at Washington the past 2 seasons, and Washington improved their defense from one of the worst to they're in the top, is either top 25 or top 30 as far as their defensive front while he was there. He also spent time with Aranda at Wisconsin, and then they bring in their inside linebackers. So you can see they addressed from a coaching staff. They're addressing the line of scrimmage and coaches who will impact the running game on both sides of the ball. So that's going to be something that is going to be key to watch. Now, a metric that I track is point differential. Baylor had a negative 123 point differential, so they gave up 123 points more last year. That was second worst in the Big 12. They have quite a gap to go to improve in that area. I like this as a metric, as an indicator of how good you are. I don't think it tells the whole story, to be clear, but I think it's a good metric to say. For instance, Kansas State 200 plus point positive point differential, Arizona State 169 point negative point differential. Well, it's pretty clear those two teams certainly are near the top and the bottom ends of the conference by pretty solidly in those areas. So it's a measure of how far you have to go to get to be, we'll call it middle of the ground. And of note here, BYU negative 81 point differential. That's going to be a metric to watch. Is can they avoid those blowouts this year, even if they're going to lose 5, 6, 7 games? Okay, now recruiting for Baylor, again, continuing on this 30,000 foot view level. Baylor's bringing in some of the best talent in the conference, and you'll see this here in a second. But they're bringing in above average 3 stars. So 24/7 Sports it's got their ratings. 5 stars started at a 98. Average player rating, 4 stars started at a 90, and 3 stars at an 80. Baylor in the last 5 years, they've been sitting there about a mid 86, low 87 average player rating. So that's pretty good. And when you look at the rest of the Big 12, you can see they're not in the upper echelon, but they are, I would call them, in the second quartile there, the second tier in terms of quality of talent. And you can see that they've been pretty consistent. There's some teams that have been improving and some teams that have been not been improving. So I think what that's interesting to me is that Baylor, perhaps outside of the Big 12, Baylor may have this residual perception that they are a cellar dweller team because they were for so long. But clearly around the time of RG3, they started to improve dramatically. Art Briles helped them improve dramatically. Matt Rule helped him. But they're recruiting, and this could be the fact that they're in Texas, but they are recruiting good players. So if they put it together, they've got a lot of talent there. Now, let's jump to the offense here. So key stories for the offense. One is that new offensive staff that I talked about. This is going to be a big story. Jake Spavital, and honestly all those coaches, they're in a bit of a risky position. So they've got a lot to gain here too and lose, because if Aranda goes, and they're going to go too. I mean, the chances that the new coach that they would bring in would keep those guys is not high. So they know that they're taking a risk that they can nail it. and stay there longer term, because they don't want to be looking for a new job again in December. And then the second key story is that this team has got to rebuild the offensive line. They had some youth there, but they also they brought in some 5 offensive linemen from the transfer portal, and then 3 high school recruits. So they brought in a lot of talent there. And when I went back and looked in 2021 and 2022, each of those years they had 2 offensive linemen make the all-conference team, and last year they didn't have anyone make the all-conference team. So that is, and you'll see again in the metrics here in a minute, they've got to rebuild that offensive line. And then the third question I had is Daquan Finn, the answer at quarterback. So he's a transfer from Toledo. I haven't seen that he's officially been named the starting quarterback, but a few notes about him. So he threw for over 2,000 yards. It was about mid-2000s last year. 20 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. And his completion percentage was just about 66%. So that was good for 57th in the country. He's noted, he was the MAC Player of the Year. He's noted as a dual threat quarterback. And the reason why I look and wonder, is he the answer at quarterback, is because if you go back a few years, we all know Gary Bohannon was there in 21, but he doesn't finish the season due to injury. Blake Shapen plays in the Big 12 championship and leads the team to a victory. And then in that spring, it looks like Shapen's going to win the starting job. So Bohannon transfers to USF. And then Shapen's up and down in 2022. And then he's got some injuries in 23. In the meantime, Baylor had a backup quarterback on the roster who was a 4-star, Kyron Drones. He transfers out in 23. He goes to Virginia Tech, where he plays last year, and he's looking. He's the starter this year, and Virginia Tech is looking like a dark horse to win the ACC. And then Shapen transfers out this offseason. He transfers out to Mississippi State. Maybe you say that's a step up because he goes to the SEC, but maybe he's struggling. Maybe he doesn't know because the offensive staff is changing. And now they bring in Daquan Finn. So they haven't had a lot of stability at that position in the last several years. And that's what raises the question for me is, will Finn be able to come in? He's going to have to learn a new offensive system. Of course, everyone is at that school, but Spavital may be able to utilize him given some of the players that he's utilized in the past, like Johnny Manziel, who had a bit of that sporadic running, kind of that crazed runner type, random style. So we'll see there. Now, on the defensive side, Dave Aranda calling the shots. That's the first big storyline that I've mentioned here. He came from LSU as the DC there. They won when they won the national title. In fact, in 2019, he was there from 26 to 2019, and then at Wisconsin previous to that as the defensive coordinator from 13 to 15. He was at Utah State as the defensive coordinator 2012, and then Hawaii prior to that for 2 years as the DC. So he's doing this because he's got to see improvement from snap one of game one. And then I mentioned those new defensive line and inside linebacker coaches. And then the third story is, do they have enough to stop the run game? Between the coaching changes, can they develop the players that they brought in? So they brought in 3 defensive line transfers that have an average player rating of 87 per 24/7. I'll be curious to see if they've done enough. And when you look at some of the reporting there around that program, they feel like they had a youth movement last year. So does that turn into player development for this year to where they start to see some success? I don't know. We'll see. Now I'm going to jump to some data, but before I jump to some data here, I've got to do my mandatory pun read because I'm not sponsored, and so I'm going to do a pun read, and this is in spirit of the Olympics. What did the archer say when she nearly got shot at the archery contest? Quote, "Wow, that was an arrow escape." And then second, what kind of a phone does an Olympic gymnast use? Well, they use a flip phone. And lastly, what's the best part of an Olympic boxer's joke? It's the punchline. So there you go. All right, now going to pivot and going to share some data on screen now. That I'm going to walk you through this. It's going to feel like it's blistering pace. Hopefully it does. So I'd love to hear feedback on this, as well as specific data that you'd want to see more or less of, and perhaps formats that may or may not be helpful. All right, so total yards per game last year, Baylor was 72nd in the country at 377 yards per game, and they were 99th in points per game. So they averaged 23 points per game. In the passing game, they weren't that bad, actually. They were 41st in the country at 263 yards per game. But the running game is where they started to struggle. They were 112th in the country at the running game. So they averaged 115 yards per game. Not that great. Of note here, BYU was 121st. They averaged just over 104 yards per game. If they hadn't had those games against Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, they would have been less than 100 yards per game. And Baylor was averaging 3.3 yards per carry last year, which actually, just interesting side note, Colorado was the worst in the country, 2.3. But Baylor at 3.3, that's not going to be. So that's what I'm talking about this offensive line. They've got to improve. Now, a metric that I look at that's an advanced metric is I'm not the creator of, but guys at some really smart guys, CFB FastR, they put together these metrics, offensive success rate. I've written and spoken about this, so I won't go into great detail, but it's essentially the higher the percentage, the better your offense is at staying on schedule. So staying on schedule meaning first down, get over 5 yards. Second down, get 70% of the yards there left. And if you're not getting the first down on your second down, then you should be getting it on your third down. And you keep marching that through. Baylor was 102nd worst in the country. They had a 39.5 percent offensive success rate. They were one of the worst in the Big 12 last year. And another advanced metric, offensive line yards. So this is the percentage of rushing yards that we can attribute to the offensive line. Typically, the shorter the run, the more yardage gets attributed to that offensive line, and the longer the run, the less those yards get attributed. So if a team has quite a few yards rushing, and a lot of those are longer plays, they're actually not going to get as much attributed to the offensive line, because they're going to say the offensive line did a good job opening a hole, and then the back took advantage of that. But if you've got a team that's offensive line is struggling, what you're going to see is more offensive line yards. And now what I've got here, this is actually if you see on video, this is per carry. And so the fact that Baylor is less, I know this is gonna not be as intuitive, so I may adjust this graph going forward. But what you can see here is that Baylor's offensive line struggled to open up big holes, so they've got a smaller offensive line yard per carry. Anyways, I may adjust this one going forward, but the story is consistent. And then explosiveness. This is a measure of essentially how explosive. So plays over 15 yards is how I measure it. And Baylor was right in the middle of the country, 71st. Now, when I look again at the conference, total yards per game, Baylor was about a middle of the pack in the Big 12 last year. They were 5th in the conference at passing yards per game, but then rushing yards, they were, I'm looking at the constitution of the new Big 12 here. They were 4th worst in the country in the conference last year at rushing yards per game. BYU 2nd worst in the conference last year. So both teams have a need to improve. A point on that game between BYU and Baylor: the team that wins this line of scrimmage battle, that generally goes for any game, like they're going to win. But in particular for that game, the team that can win the line of scrimmage battle is the team that's going to win. All right, so yeah, Baylor 3.3. So they actually had the 2nd worst rushing yards per carry last year in the conference. from a sacks allowed perspective, Baylor was second worst in the country. So they are in the conference. So they allowed 34 sacks per game. This is all pointing to an offensive line that really struggled. They were middle of the conference in turnovers, and then when you look at yard differential, they had a negative yard differential, so they were allowing 43, 44 more yards per game than what they gained. And again, we went over the point differential. From a turnover margin, they were a +1. So BYU was also a +1. They didn't generate as many turnovers. In fact, if I go back to their turnovers, actually we'll get to that one in a minute here, as far as what type of turnovers they generated. So fourth worst offensive success rate. Offensive success rate, you might talk about like efficient. That might be another way to look at it. One angle to look at it. It's not quite that, but this is I've correlated this with it certainly correlates with points scored, and the higher your offensive success rate, typically the more points you're going to score. So that's why I like this metric. And BYU was the worst in the conference last year in offensive success rate. I'm going to skip ahead to some of these. Like I said, Baylor, middle of the pack in explosiveness. BYU, interestingly, was the third best explosive offense last year in the conference. And what that tells you is when BYU moved the ball, they really moved the ball. And when they didn't, they just didn't move the ball. And most of the time, they didn't move the ball. So that's going to be something to watch this year. Now, defensively, Baylor 114th in the country in yards, in points allowed per game. So they allowed 33 points per game. They were 113th in terms of total yards allowed per game. I like points allowed as a better metric in terms of how you measure a defense. And interestingly enough, BYU 99th last year in points allowed per game at just under 30. And then when you jump ahead to a few other metrics here, so you rushing yards, Baylor was okay with passing yards allowed, but again, with the rushing yards they allowed, they were 120th in 120th worst team. They allowed 185 yards per game rushing. That's not good. That is really not good. Allowed 5 yards per carry. And then turnovers created, so they were 84th in the country in generating turnovers. They had 9 fumbles and 7 interceptions. They've had really talented defensive secondary in the past, so you'd like to see that interception number come up quite a bit more. And if you're curious, BYU last year was 35th in the country at turnovers. They had 14 interceptions, so twice as many interceptions as Baylor. I think that's positive for BYU. They're trending in the right direction defensively. I'd expect BYU to be better this year defensively. Against sacks, Baylor was 120th worst. They only had 18 sacks that they generated last year. Not good, but BYU, well, they were second worst they were tied for worst in the country at 11 sacks per game, 11 sacks total last year. They were tied with Boston College and Virginia, so that's where BYU must improve this next year. Defensive success rate, few other metrics real quick, is Baylor's. So this is where you want to see the defensive success rate be low. And actually, I'm going to jump ahead to the conference in this case. So if you're on screen, obviously you're seeing me fast forward. If you're not, then you're seeing me zoom ahead. And Baylor was not great at defensive success rate. Havoc rate, this was an interesting metric. So this is the percentage of plays that the DBs intercept or break up. Baylor was middle of the pack there. And they've got some other havoc rates. Pressure rate, QB hurries plus sacks divided by the number of passes. Baylor was 10.7. They were the third worst in the conference, and BYU was worst in the conference. So again, speaking to the need to put more pressure. And so I'm going to stop sharing there. All right. Now, thank you for following along with Baylor. I'm going to pivot for a minute here and talk about BYU receivers. So with BYU receivers, I've got a concern here that I'm not hearing anyone talk about, because I may be the only person that has this concern. But the concern is that BYU, while they have one of their most talented groups that they've had, certainly under Fesi Sataki, as he's noted, is I'm not sure that they have a true number one. I think they have Lassiter and Roberts who profile as guys who could be a number one receiver, but I need to see them be more consistent next year, or this year. I need to see them be more consistent. And the concern that I have with that number one is the separation. That there's a skill to be able to separate whether you are able to be more athletic than a guy, faster, or your route precision running, something that enables you to get separation. Why do I say this? Well, do we trust that every game that Roberts or Lassiter are playing, that BYU's got a Puka Nacua, who on a 4th and goal from the 7 against Boise State can come down with that catch? Lassiter and Roberts certainly had some amazing catches against Arkansas and Texas Tech last year, but when you look up and down, I'll just take Roberts. So he was their top receiver last year in terms of total yards and total yards per game. But when I look up and down his production, 62% of his production came through the Cincinnati game in terms of production in terms of total yards. So 5 games in, with 7 games left, he's already gotten 62% of his production. That's not good. By the time that they play Texas Tech 2 weeks later, so at this point this is game 7 for them, he's at 75% of his production. So with 5 games left, 25% of his season production came, and he only got 1 more touchdown in those last 5 games. So cumulatively, he got 143 yards over the last 5 games. So he's getting 30 yards per game in those last 5 games against Texas, West Virginia, Iowa State, Oklahoma State. Arguably the tougher part of the schedule. Well, now that we know West Virginia and Iowa State were as good as they were, that was the top end of the conference last year. And BYU, that's where they really struggled from a receiving standpoint. That's where Roberts struggled. So, he had the last 2 games, he had 49 yards. Now I know he had at times there's certainly people get nicked up, and he had some nicks and bruises and injuries, but I haven't seen the production yet week in, week out. And I think about last year in 2022, he has a great game against Baylor, and then against Oregon the next week's opening play, he's got a good reception, and then he's not really present the rest of the game. So will BYU, between Lassiter, Roberts, one of those guys, or someone else, I don't know, maybe it's Keelan Marion, can one of those guys step up and be a game in, game out receiver? And I think this is important, because if you look at, and I'm going to share on screen here just real quick, if you look at the receivers last year in the Big 12, what you'll notice is, so T-Mac from Arizona, he had 1,400 yards. There were over 20 guys who had more yards than BYU's top receiver. UCF had a couple of guys. Not very many guys got over 1,000 yards last year. There were only 3 guys over 1,000 yards, but Oklahoma State's top receiver was just under 1,000. Iowa State's was just under 1,000. UCF had 2 guys over 900 yards. Colorado had a guy over 900. Texas and Oklahoma both had a guy over 900, and then 2 guys who were at just about 800 or more. Houston had a guy over 800. Iowa State actually had 2 guys over 800. So you go down the line, and BYU, I want to say Chase Roberts was 27th, I want to say, best in terms of total yards last year. If BYU wants to get to a bowl game, they've got to find a way, whether it's Roberts or maybe Keanu Hill, who could be one of the most underspoken about guys and could be a real asset to Retzlaff or Bohannon early in the season. I actually think Hill's going to have a really good year this year, but I'd like to see Roberts increase from 573 yards last year to I'd like to see him over 800 yards. And if BYU wants to get to a bowl game, if he gets over 900, I think that's great. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks for joining on in today. Like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, feedback. Love to hear it. And thanks, and we'll see you next time.